Alright, so we're picking up with section 4.2 where I left off in the last video. We had talked about the Pythagorean identity and done a couple of examples there. So now we're going to talk about what a periodic function is. Now, a function f is periodic if there exists a positive number p such that f of t plus p equals f of t. Now this is for any value of t. And that's what it means here, for all t in the domain of f. So any value t that I choose, I can also add p to it and get the exact same thing as if I plugged in just plain old t. So what this means is you're going to have the same values over and over that occur p further in the domain. Now, the smallest positive number p for which f is periodic is called the period of f. So what we're doing is we have a certain amount or certain values of a function that occur over and over and over again. That's what it means when you've got a periodic function. Now, sine and cosine are periodic functions. And their properties say that the sine of t plus 2 pi is equal to sine t. This is for any value of t. You can plug in 4 right here. And the sine of 4 plus 2 pi is going to equal the sine of 4. And cosine has the same property with the same periodic value of p. So the sine and cosine functions are periodic functions, and they have a period of 2 pi. Now, tangent, you're going to see, is periodic also, but it has a period of pi instead of 2 pi. You're going to have the same values here as you do down here. You're going to have the same values here as you would down here. And because you're dealing with the same numbers, the only difference is your signs, S-I-G-N. And in here, we know that sine over cosine, positive over positive, is going to give us positive. Down here, we know sine over cosine, or negative over negative, is going to give us a positive. And here, with the alternating signs on the top and the bottom of your trig, then you're going to get a negative value for tangent. All right, so find the value of each trigonometric function. All right, so what you can do here is, if we think of this as the sine of pi over 4 plus 2 pi, well, pi over 4 and 2 pi in terms of pi over 4 is 8 pi over 4. So pi over 4 plus 8 pi over 4 gives us 9 pi over 4. But the big thing is the fact that it's 2 pi. Remember, what does that mean? Well, that means that since sine is periodic, the sine of pi over 4 plus 2 pi, or the sine of 9 pi over 4, is equal to the sine of pi over 4. And what do we know the sine of pi over 4 is? It's square root of 2 over 2. All right, now tangent, remember, it's periodic for pi. So the tangent of negative pi over 4 is the same thing as the tangent of negative pi over 4 minus 4 pi over 4. And then what do we know there? Hold on, let me make that a little clearer there. Minus 4 pi over 4. And this is pi, and with the plus here, this is actually going to be plus or minus. You can add or subtract. It doesn't matter. So that's the case here. We're subtracting. And what do we know the tangent of negative pi over 4 minus 4 pi over 4 is going to equal? Well, that's going to equal the tangent of negative pi over 4 because of the whole periodic thing. Now, you're probably wondering, well, we haven't learned any of the tangents or anything for negative angles. Well, actually we have, but we learned them in the fact that tangent is an odd function, so therefore the tangent of negative pi over 4 is the same thing as the negative tangent of pi over 4. And what's the tangent of pi over 4? Well, it's 1. So this is going to give us negative 1. All right, I want you guys to try these two, and I'm going to show you the answer, but I want you to check your work, pause the video, give these two a try, and then turn the video back on and check your answer, and I'll show you the answer in 3, 2, 1. All right, so here's the work for these two. Cotangent of 5 pi over 4 is periodic in the same way that tangent is, so you got pi instead of 2 pi. Those are the only two that are periodic over a value of pi. Sine, cosine, cosecant, and secant are all going to be periodic over 2 pi. So you're going to add or subtract 2 pi to get to the same value. So here we're going to subtract pi, in this case, as in terms of 4 pi over 4. And that should be a plus, not a minus. And so we've got 5 pi over 4 is equal to pi over 4 plus 4 pi over 4, which is true. And this means that cotangent of pi over 4 plus 4 pi over 4 is equal to cotangent of pi over 4, which is just the reciprocal of tangent of pi over 4, which is 1. All right, and the cosine here, you got negative 9 pi over 4, so we're dealing with negatives, so we're going to subtract. And we're dealing with cosine, so we're adding or subtracting 2 pi from it. So the cosine of negative 9 pi over 4 we can break down into the cosine of negative pi over 4 minus 8 pi over 4. That's 2 pi. So that means that the cosine of negative pi over 4 minus 8 pi over 4 is the same thing as cosine of negative pi over 4. And once we know that cosine is an even function, which means the cosine of negative theta is just the same thing as cosine theta. In other words, this negative right here doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a negative pi over 4 or a positive pi over 4. It's still just going to be square root of 2 over 2. Now, we have what we call a periodic behavior is nothing more than repetitive behavior, having the same values over and over and over again. We can call that repetitive behavior. Not only that, we can actually identify how it repeats. For any integer n and any real number t, the sine of t plus 2 pi n is equal to the sine of t. So not only can we add or subtract 2 pi, we can also add 4 pi, we can also add 6 pi, we can also subtract 2 pi if the n's a negative 1, etc., etc., etc. So any multiple, any whole number multiple of 2 pi, we can add it to t. We're going to have the exact same value that we had with sine t. Same thing with cosine, and of course with tangent, instead of 2 pi, it's just going to be pi. Pi times n, where n is an integer, negative or positive.